Before lunch here, what we're going to do is kind of get down into, first of all, literally the black and white of what the Northwest Forest Plan has to say about this over 80 thing. I think sometimes we forget, because those documents are 20 years old, that there's a lot of information in there and a lot of things written, and some of us may not have read it recently. So Nancy Lankford, who is a natural resources staff on the Mount Hood, is going to remind us about what the Northwest Forest Plan says. She's currently in an acting role up in the regional office, and I'll let her tell you what that is, because it's a really long, important title, and I don't want to get it wrong. So help me welcome Nancy, everybody.
Thank you. And yeah, my first task in my temporary assignment at the regional office was being able to say my title in one breath. And so I'm currently filling in as the Acting Assistant Director for Natural Resources for Vegetation and Forest Products. So I'm filling behind Tracy Beck, who is now the Forest Supervisor on the Willamette National Forest. And it's been a really interesting assignment so far. But what I'm going to talk about, I think on the agenda it says what the Northwest Forest Plan says about 80-plus-year-old trees, and from a practitioner's perspective. And as I was thinking about this, I opted to not take kind of the tidbits about the on-the-ground implementation, but literally, what does the Northwest Forest Plan say? Because those are some of the questions that I typically get. Where can and can't we do treatments, and what are the ecological considerations for our forest management? And I was also very curious to dive back into the Northwest Forest Plan and see where the 80-year-old threshold came from in the text. And then again, what actions are appropriate for the different land designations. So I imagine there's a lot of people in this audience that are very familiar with the Northwest Forest Plan. So perhaps this is just a little bit of review or setting the stage for the rest of the day. And then perhaps there's a few, this might be a little bit of a Northwest Forest Plan primer. And this is just Northwest Forest Plan, so it doesn't talk about individual forest plans or critical habitat, etc. Okay. The arrow's on here instead? Okay. Okay, here we go. So, I'm very appreciative for the other presenters who had very nice pictorial slides, because these are literally black and white. Cheryl wasn't kidding when she said black and white. So I first wanted to look at what the Northwest Forest Plan said about the ecological principles, or the underpinnings for management of late successional forests. And I mainly looked in two places. Appendix B2 from the final environmental impact statement has a very nice summary if you haven't looked at it. And the intent of that was to try to clarify the intent of the standards and guidelines in order to provide guidance for situations that maybe weren't specifically covered by the standards and guidelines. And then also Chapter B of the Record of Decision, or ROD, also has the basis for the standards and guidelines. So in terms of structure and composition, structural characteristics of late successional and old growth forests, as we've heard about this morning, vary widely with vegetation type, disturbance regime, and developmental stage. So it's really not a one-size-fits-all by any means. And for an example, in many Douglas fir stands in western Oregon and Washington, the mature phase of stand development begins around 80 years and is characterized by relatively large live and dead trees. That's from at the point it was publication in press, although multiple canopy layers may not yet well be developed. I've also on these slides put the actual citations so you can dive into the ROD further. But this was one of the key points where it talks about mature stands and old-growth stands beginning around 80 years. We've talked earlier this morning about the major structural attributes of old-growth forests: live old-growth trees, standing dead trees, fallen trees or logs on the forest floor, and logs in streams. And that's included in the Northwest Forest Plan, as well as the important elements: multiple canopy layers, smaller understory trees, canopy gaps, and patchy understory. Other ecological processes include, and in terms of processes instead of structure, tree growth and maturation, death and decay of large trees, low to moderate intensity disturbances, and establishment of understory trees and gaps. These processes result in forests moving through different stages of late successional and old growth conditions that may span from as early as 80 years to as long as 1,200 years for forests dominated by long-lived species. The maturation stage is characterized by several different items: a slowed rate of height growth and crown expansion, heavy limbs begin to form, crowns become larger and more stable, large dead and fallen trees begin to accumulate, and the understory may see some establishment of seedlings and saplings in the shade-tolerant species. So in Douglas fir stands west of the Cascade Range, this stage typically begins between 80 and 140 years, depending on site conditions and stand history. So there's that 80-year-old figure again. So in terms of what activities may be appropriate for the different land designations, the role of silviculture in late successional reserves have two principal objectives. One is the development of old-growth forest characteristics, which includes those elements we talked about earlier. The second is prevention of large-scale disturbances by fire, wind, insects, and diseases that would destroy or limit the ability of the reserves to sustain viable forest populations. So two main objectives there. In contrast, the role of silviculture in matrix, the objectives for silviculture should include production of commercial yields of wood, including species that require extended rotations, retention of moderate levels of ecologically valuable old-growth components, such as snags, logs, and relatively large trees, and increasing ecological diversity by providing early successional habitat. So that's for the matrix. In terms of standard and guidelines for the late successional reserves, this slide is for west of the Cascades. And the one standard that I think we're well familiar with is that there is no harvest allowed in stands over 80 years old in the LSRs. And that figure is actually 110 years in the adaptive management area for the northern Cascades. Thinning may occur in stands up to 80 years old regardless of the origin of the stands. I think there was a question this morning about natural versus plantations. The overall purpose is to benefit the creation and maintenance of late successional forest conditions. And some examples of treatments that may be appropriate to and considered beneficial could include thinning in an existing even-age stands or prescribed burning. However, there's another category for treatments in LSRs, and that's the risk reduction category. So east of the Cascades and in the Oregon and California Klamath provinces, additional management activities are allowed in LSRs. And that's due to the increased risk in these areas from lower moisture conditions and rapid accumulation of fuels after insect outbreaks and drought. These activities in older stands could also be undertaken in late successional reserves in other provinces if the levels of risk are particularly high and you have a solid rationale for wanting to treat those stands for risk reduction. So again, risk reduction, that 80-year-old threshold applies to silvicultural treatments, and if you have a solid rationale for treatments for risk reduction, that could include older stands. So while risk reduction efforts should generally be focused on the young stands, activities in older stands may be appropriate if, and you need these 3 items, the proposed management activities will clearly result in a greater assurance of long-term maintenance of habitat. The activities are clearly needed to reduce risks, and the activities will not prevent the late successional reserves from playing an effective role in the objectives for which they were established. There's also a category in the Northwest Forest Plan for salvage and late successional reserves. And this is mainly following a large stand replacing event. So anything less than 10 acres is not considered. The salvage guidelines are intended to prevent negative effects on late successional habitat while permitting some commercial wood volume removal. Salvage sales need to either be beneficial to late successional habitat objectives or neutral to the attainment of those objectives. However, the Ninth Circuit Court opinion on the timbered rock sale ruled that salvage has to be beneficial to the LSR, not just neutral. So if within the regional office, there's a regional ecosystem office, and there's a group called the LSR Work Group that does consistency reviews to ensure that we're following the Northwest Forest Plan appropriately. So if a project is being proposed that's not covered by an approved LSR assessment, or there are also some silviculture exemption criteria for planting and commercial thinning of younger stands. So if it doesn't fit any of those criteria, the project needs to be brought to the LSR work group for review to provide concurrence that projects are consistent with the Northwest Forest Plan. Also, if a project's not consistent, other items such as pipelines, et cetera, site-specific rationale could be brought forward to the Regional Interagency Executive Committee to consider a forest plan amendment. And there's a very nice document that was prepared in 2009 that talks about consistency reviews, and it has a really nice decision tree as well as a checklist and some summary tables of these different categories and where treatments are appropriate or not. So for matrix stand management, stands in the matrix can be managed for timber and other commodity production and to perform an important role in maintaining biodiversity. Silvicultural treatments in the matrix can provide for retention of old growth components that we've talked about before, large green trees, snags, down logs, and for a diversity of species. And you'll note there was not a mention of age class. So some of the objectives there for coarse woody debris, providing that well distributed across the landscape, as well as scattered green trees to provide a future supply of down woody material as the stand regenerates. And specific measures include providing a renewable supply of large down logs and retention of coarse woody debris during treatments, and leaving logs and patches retained under green tree retention. So again, it's protecting some of those old growth components. The Northwest Forest Plan also calls for green tree retention in the matrix, and this is to retain these the green trees following timber harvest to provide a legacy that bridges past and future forests. Retaining these green trees serves several important functions, including snag recruitment, multi-storied canopies, shade, and suitable habitat for many organisms. Retaining green trees of various sizes, ages, and species in well-distributed patches as well as dispersed individuals will promote species diversity. And diversity of tree structure should be considered when selecting those for retention. So if there is a regeneration harvest unit, the standard and guidelines say to retain at least 15% of the area associated with that unit. And of that, 70% should be in patches or aggregates of moderate to large size, and the remainder as dispersed or individual structures. To the extent possible, these should retain the largest, oldest live trees, decadent or leaning trees, and hard snags. And these patches are to be retained indefinitely to provide support for those organisms that require very old forests. This retention does not apply to intermediate harvests and even age young stands, although of course you could consider those ecological considerations. In addition, landscapes that have little late successional forest within a fifth field watershed, if they are currently comprised of less than 15% late successional forest, there's a standard and guideline that says within such an area, all remaining late successional stands should be protected. I've got just a couple slides on survey and managed species. So we're from the 2001 record of decision. These standards and guidelines apply within all land allocations, and the provisions for each species will be directed to the range or habitat where concerns exist, and for management activities that would be considered habitat disturbing. Currently, the Forest Service is implementing the 2001 record of decision using these species list here, and and some of the projects are, exempt from the survey and managed standards and guidelines as stipulated by the court and Judge Peckman. So folks have often referred to the Peckman exemption. So some of these species we don't survey for if the stands are less than 80 years old. Kind of another place where we've brought in that 80. So just a couple, conclusion statements here or bottom lines. I know that was a lot of text and just a reciting of standard and guidelines, but the bottom line is the 80-year-old threshold is only mentioned in the context of the LSR, although the ecological principles are throughout the land designations. And in the matrix, the standard and guidelines are to assure appropriate conservation of ecosystems as well as provide habitat for rare and lesser known species. And I think just a last reminder that I wanted to state, this is Northwest Forest Plan. I hope this sets the stage for conversations later this afternoon, where we'll also be bringing in critical habitat considerations. And also in the matrix, folks always have to remember the underlying forest plan for the individual forest. And I think that's it. Any questions? Yeah.
Nancy, let's see, risk reduction. Drought was one of the factors that would be a trigger. How would you accurately assess and quantify the effects of its drought on the forest or regional level or landscape kind of level? And what level of drought could trigger an intervention? So
Yeah, so the question, Russ, and if I don't get it right here, let me know. Basically, with the risk reduction category for treatments in LSRs, what is the rationale or what would be needed to show that drought plays a function in that?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be real easy to say, okay, we've got a lot of red needle trees because of people, but teasing out the effects of the drought would seem a little harder to me. It wasn't something I got in forestry school, so I figured that out.
Yeah, so Russ was also asking about how you tease out the effects of the drought on, say, red needle trees that have been killed by insects.
No, what I meant was, you know, if
Sorry.
you're doing an aerial survey and you see red bugs, you can say, oh, but, you know, are we seeing similar data? Can we get similar data for drought? You know, to say the level of drought effect in this area has risen above a threshold where we would say, okay, it's time to intervene.
Yeah. So I don't think I'm probably the person to answer what tools we have and how we can quantify the actual effects of drought. But in terms of risk reduction in the Northwest Forest Plan, basically one would have to make the argument and the case and provide a solid rationale that those effects, whether it's drought or other activity, are negatively impacting the late successional reserve, or would put it in such a position of threat or risk that it's not maintaining those objectives over the long term without some active management. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, in the discussions that are happening with the new process for revising forest plans and grouping forests and things like that, how relevant will this current record of decision stand within that new forest division process?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so the question is, would the current listening sessions and look at forest plan revisions and listening sessions regarding Northwest Forest Plan, how will this existing record of decision stay or not with that effort? Was that the question? That's a very good question, and I think I would just say at the beginning, we're at the very beginning of looking at that question and how the forest will look at both the Northwest Forest Plan and their Forest Plan amendment. We've got some proposals that are being considered now on how we can do that across multiple forests or groups of forests, and we're still determining how to proceed. So the first step was at the listening session, and I think the listening session report actually was just released yesterday, so that's available. I know that the tables I was at one of those sessions did say that we had there is a lot of interest in maintaining the Northwest Forest Plan, and I know the region is committed to retaining the concepts of the Northwest Forest Plan. Yeah.
On the North Coast, we also have adaptive management area, which allows us to harvest up to 110 years, where there is LSR, which is also AMA.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I feel like is that we also have just pure AMA that's not also LSR. And it's my understanding that I'm a little fuzzy on this, it's my understanding that you don't have that 110-year limitation on those areas. And I just wondered if you knew about the sort of direction for those areas or where that would fall.
Okay, so the question was in the North Coast, they have an adaptive management area as well as LSRs, and I mentioned the 110-year-old standard, but there's an AMA that's also LSR, and then there's an AMA that's just a strict adaptive management area, and does that 110-year-old rule apply? I'm going to have to defer to that. I don't know enough about each and every AMA, and they vary. So, but I would be happy to dive in and look at that with you later. Okay. Oops. There's one.
Sorry,
Do you want-
one more. I just had a question about carbon sequestration. Is that mentioned anywhere in the Northwest Forest Plan? And the ability of soils as a carbon store?
Norm, Jerry, is
Yeah.
Certainly not highlighted.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so the question was carbon sequestration mentioned in the Northwest Forest Plan. Cheryl and I were kind of giving each other stares and trying to remember because there's a lot that was in the in the EIS and the FEMAT report prior to that, but we just asked Norm and Jerry here, and if anything, it was not highlighted in the Northwest Forest Plan, if it was mentioned much at all. Okay.